Welcome to Long Lost Friends. I'm Elizabeth Eve King.
I'm Andrea Goyan. Elizabeth and I used to do improv comedy together in bars in San Francisco before we were legal. And then we lost touch.
And a few years ago, we discovered each other, found we're both legal, and we're both painters,
Performers,
animal lovers,
Pilates teachers.
naturalists.
Elizabeth, I am not a naturalist. I love nature, but I don't know where you thought that.
Well, loving nature counts. The point is
We're long lost
friends.
And we're both award-winning fiction writers.
After one of my short stories appeared in MetaStellar, we started this show.
MetaStellar is an online magazine, and we publish original science fiction, fantasy, and horror. There's a link below for more information.
Today, we are so delighted to be talking with Eric Guignard. He's a writer. He's an editor of dark and speculative fiction, operating from the shadowy outskirts of Los Angeles, where he also runs the small press Dark Moon Books. He's twice won the Bram Stoker Award. Congratulations. Has over 100 stories, nonfiction author credits. There'll be links below. And he also does the really fascinating primer series we're going to talk about. Outside the glamorous, jet-setting world of indie fiction, Eric's a technical writer, a college professor, and he stumbles home each day to a wife, children, dogs, and a terrarium filled with mischievous beetles. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you so much. And it's certainly a pleasure to chat with both of you. And I'm very appreciative of your time today and for thinking highly enough to bring me along.
Sorry to interrupt, but before we get into the nitty gritty, Elizabeth has some very special little creature to show us today,
Look,
which we can barely see.
A 9-day-old, can you see it? Cockatiel. Come on, stand up. See, it stands on its little legs already, sort of.
Don't let it fall off your hand.
Oh, that is amazing.
Isn't that? It needs to be fed every 2
Looking
hours.
more and more like a bird.
Yeah, someday it's going to look like a bird. See, it's almost got eyes. There.
When will its eyes open?
I think in a day or two, it's going to start, because these are they're not even eyes yet. It's not that they're closed, there's skin over them. You can it's like a little embryo.
Kind of like mice and rats and kittens and puppies all have that.
Yeah,
Those
and his
eyes.
weird little nose.
Yeah, it's really weird.
And that's his crop where all his food is. And then since I've got one other to show you.
And that's your husband taking the bird
This is
back.
my husband, the other wild animal, my assistant, right? And here's a little meadowlark.
Oh,
Oh,
that
he's
is
cute.
gorgeous.
Just shit on my computer. Thank you.
That'll show
Okay, you
you.
know it's a healthy bird, but isn't that cool? I haven't
Really
had
cool.
meadowlarks before.
Really beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
Kevin.
Kevin.
He's my Vanna White. That Vanna White, for those of you who are young, was somebody who used to like hand things to people on a show. Not
It's
birds.
bizarre
though.
that we live in a world where you have to explain who Vanna White is.
I know. Can you believe that? Shocking. So, Eric, we will meet your pets next time, but this time I'm really, really fascinated by that primer series. It's such a fabulous thing to do for writers and readers. You want to tell us about it?
Absolutely, I'd love to. So I put together what I like to call as you mentioned, the primer series. Its full title is Exploring Dark Short Fiction. And essentially, I'm looking at ways to promote horror, dark fantasy, dark fiction in general, with readers, with students, with fans alike. Simply bringing a greater awareness to the genre and to specific authors as well. My thought is, I'm a father of children that go in school. I've gone through school and college, and you talk to peers. Generally, the genre of horror is given very little credibility in literature classes. It's very rarely ever spoken or discussed unless it's a very specific class in a specific program. And if horror writing is discussed, it's generally discussed in these old archaic terms. Here's the foundation of horror. Here are the same authors, wonderful authors, Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, not taking anything away from them, but they're stale. It's stale what they've written. We could talk about it for forever, but there are living authors today that deserve just as much to be as part of these conversations as these authors that died 100, 200 years ago, when we're writing about, the fears of those social ilk and those generations of our great grandparents. Authors today that I wanted to look at and I wanted to explore a little bit more are those that I feel, and I call them, they are the modern masters of short story writing. And of course, it's a very subjective term, and it's based on my own criteria. And I didn't even discuss this with anybody, and it's a list that I made. So I did, I bracketed out. I made a list of here authors that I think are relevant, but then I have to jumble it around and think, here's somebody that I really want to explore, or here's somebody that I think would bring more relevance to the series, or here's somebody that I think that, students will really latch onto. So for example,
do you use this in your classes?
No, I don't. I teach technical writing, which is it's so boring, and writing like user manuals and guides and technical how-tos. But I am hoping that other teachers, and some teachers do, that I have relationships that I've built with libraries and book clubs and teachers all over the world that do go through and they involve these books into their curriculum. So for example,
how many have you done? I'm sorry, and then go into that. How many are there now?
I have completed 6 volumes so far, and then I'm working on the 7th volume, and I'm a little behind on it. But my 7th volume, I'm so excited to get it out. One of my favorite authors is Gemma Files, and she is a Canadian dark fantasy horror author. She just explores a lot of different issues that I haven't seen in the books. And again, I'm really looking forward to getting hers out. But I've done Steve Rasnick-Tem was the very first author that I had a study on, and the 2nd volume is on Australian author Karen Warren. I've also done Nisi Shaw, Jeffrey Ford, Chinese author Han Song, in which I contracted a translator who actually translated for the first time his writing into the English language.
Do you speak Chinese?
I'm sorry?
Do you read Chinese?
I do not. No, it was a challenge. Fortunately, the author Han Song, he can communicate in English.
How did you find him then?
That's what I was going to ask, Elizabeth. How did you know about him?
Because some of his work already has been translated into English, but he has a huge library of work that had not been translated. So it's really interesting. In China, their writing, they don't have a genre called horror. It doesn't exist. All of their horror and genre literature falls under science fiction. So it's simply science fiction. It's the science fiction umbrella, and there's a government body that oversees what is published. Because it's a communist country, if your writing is not, if it doesn't speak positively of the government, or it can't say anything that's out of line, it's not published. It's not allowed to be published, essentially. So it's a very kind of a shadowy area of work that can be done. But I was fortunate enough to work with a translator who had worked with the author previously, so they already had a relationship. And so I kind of had to rely on this translator as well as the author himself to say, here are stories that are suggestions. Because globally, there are, Han Song is one of the 3 greatest science fiction authors coming out of China. And out of those 3, he's the one who's recognized as also writing horror and more the darker tones, rather than just future technologies and aliens. Although interestingly, that's his day job. Is he writes for magazines about future technologies, and he writes about advances in technology. And so that carries over into his fiction. Although his fiction, he looks at, here are the dystopian aspects of it, and here's where the future technology could go bad. And also a lot of it is still critical of their kind of the social inequities in the country. You know, and in a lot of his work, admittedly, he's even said, he's like, I can't get it published, but he's not allowed to. Some things are, and some things still are a little bit critical of the structure, but they do manage to find a home.
So do you find, I mean, you've got several authors from different parts of the world. Do you find similar themes that people are struggling with in this time period, or do you see real differences from different culturally and country-wise?
I do find a lot of differences. In my past, I've put together anthologies as well that specifically is just meant for authors all over the world. And I only publish authors. So you have a compilation of horror writers throughout Africa, throughout South America, throughout Asia, North America, South America. And I really do get that sense as an editor, as a publisher, as a reader. There are differences in topics. I mean, there's looking at stories in Africa that are sent along. There is a huge basis for family units together having a fear of regime changes, having a fear of military upheavals, of murders and rapes and these horrors that here in America, I don't have those fears living in Los Angeles. I can write about that from what I read in the newspaper, but it's definitely secondhand information. And it's not something that I lived through. So there's a lot different tone, for example, there. And there's also a lot of, I don't want to say reliance, but suggestions of lore and supernatural mythology to kind of counteract the fears that people live with, that they're still living with. I'm gonna knock on the lintel over my door 3 times and hang feathers because that'll help to keep the bad spirits away. And like authors in South America, it's very politicized, just because likewise they have these military upheavals just so regularly that political dissidents are just openly assassinated, just vanished. There's so much different conflict in religion, military politics, and a lot of that carries over into the writing as well. So it's really fascinating seeing Scandinavian writers and tying into like Norse mythology and Middle Eastern writers. With a lot of times I'll see kind of differences in religious writing. There's so much religious conflict that carries over into speculative writing as well.
Huh.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I was thinking too, Mexican, South American, a bit that magic realism with the dark, which can be very dark, but there's that sense. And if you go there, there's that sort of magic sense that we don't have as much. What about us?
One of my future volumes, I'm planning on doing a Hispanic writer from Central America. I'd love to connect with one with a focus on magic realism. And that is definitely in my to-do list.
Oh, cool. Yeah. What about Australia? Do you find differences?
Got one. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Elizabeth, but yeah, Karen, right? Was her name Karen?
So Karen Warren, she's a school of writing onto herself. And I believe she's one of the authors that she's won the most Australian speculative fiction writing awards in history. She regularly, carts out just buckets of them. Her writing tends to revolve around ghosts. And so that doesn't necessarily reflect the culture of colonialism or differences in the political landscape there. But her own style of writing, it's heavily reliant on ghosts. But she explores ghosts in so many amazing, deeply resonant ways. Like, I love reading her writing. She's one of the few authors that I can go back and I can reread her stories over and over and over again, because they are just overwhelmingly tragic yet joyful. And she always finds this yin and yang balance where there's these beautiful moments of family and life and just the appreciation of what one has around them. And then it all unravels immediately in something that had been done earlier in the story, earlier in some aspect of the character's life, that they had set off this cursed event that's going to take generations to carry over to them. So
Wow, I'm excited now. I've got to go buy a few of these of your primers. You got me excited.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
To hear
Yeah,
that.
no, that's really fascinating. And I think it's a really
Job is done.
important thing to do too, because you're right. It's like not Lovecraft again, please, or Poe, at least Shirley Jackson. But even so, there are other writers out there, and there's a whole world.
There's so many writers, and I chose writers who are living. I wanted writers that readers can latch onto, and they can continue to watch the growth of these writers. So the writers that I have chosen as focus, there was a minimum requirement that they've been publishing professionally for at least a quarter of a century. And they've all they've won major industry awards, but they're still outputting material. They're still building their audiences. We could still look to them for their advice, for the lessons that they have, that we could still, as burgeoning writers, go to them and say, here's somebody that I can learn from, and I could still follow, and I could still kind of try to emulate their journey, if you so had a similar journey you wish to take.
So that made me think of something, which is, so you have this wide knowledge. If you, as a writer, what have you taken? What personally have you taken? Because of course there's some stuff you might love their writing, but it's not something you could personally take.
Yeah, I don't know that I have one great lesson across the different anthologies, except we hear this all the time, keep an open mind. I know I have preconceived notions all the time going into exploring new authors. I may read bad reviews. I may just look at a cover of a book. Man, I still judge books by their cover, and I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it. I'm a visual person, and if I see a bad book cover, I'm immediately turned on and I judge the author. And I know, I completely recognize it's not the author's fault if they get a terrible cover. It's the publisher and the designer and so many others, but I'll see a cover and be like, that looks terrible. But the story itself could be the greatest story I've ever read. So I really have to tell myself all the time to keep an open mind, and even keep an open mind for authors that I've read before that I'm like, I don't really like it, because I recognize authors grow. We're always trying, as writers, we're always trying to do better today than we did yesterday. And I know from my own experience, man, if somebody read something that I wrote 10 years ago, my face would go like 50 shades of red. I would just be like, I'm so embarrassed, burn it. And I like to think, I've progressed and I've grown and I've evolved since then. And I think things that I write now, these are so glorious. Hopefully 10 years down the road, I'll even look back today's writing and say, I was proud of it back then, but it does not represent who I am today, because I want to constantly keep changing and doing different things. So,
well, that's a good name for a book too, 50 Shades of Red.
Yeah.
Eric, I have a question for you. I mean, you're you don't only do these, but you also do some anthologies and things. What for you falls under the heading of horror? Because sometimes, I think horror has to be terrifying and bloody and gory, but it really doesn't. It can be so many things. And I'm only just sort of realizing that I write a lot of horror, and I never really realized it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think horror is defined differently for the individual. I mean, it's really an individual decision, but I think in its broadest sense, it's an exploration of fear.
That's a nice way to put it.
And every piece of literature and book out there, it's all about the conflict of a protagonist and antagonist, even if the antagonist is internal, and that conflict has to do with fear. You know, there's a fear of an unknown, there's a fear of a bad decision, of something, a force outside of our control that is changing things. That can speak as horror, really, in its broadest sense. I mean, generally horror for the social mindset, it's a supernatural monster. You know, it's a monster that's coming down with knives and claws and alien laser beams. But you know, horror is founded in mystery literature and crime thriller. Any sort of a bad guy holding a gun to his victim's head. I mean, that's horror. The level of horror is going to be defined a little bit differently. But so I think in general, books that want to be categorized as horror, that might be more of its emphasis is horror. So I am kind of going around your question. I'm saying there are horror elements in every type of a book. And you know, you can look at old classic Shakespeare and in English literature, and it's obviously, you take a Charles Dickens work, it's obviously not, you know, marketed as horror, although it can have horror elements in it. But but books that want to speak towards horror, that's the focus, is the exploration of the horror element. In fact, I'm going to totally take it aside and plug another series.
Okay.
That I do this series with co-editor Leslie Klinger and the Horror Writers Association, but we do take old books, classics of literature, and republish them along with discussion questions and annotations and other ancillary material. It's called the Haunted Library of Horror Classics. And this is meant to show that books that are classics, maybe in other genres, can still be treated as horror. And it's meant to promote the horror umbrella and to expand the idea that horror isn't necessarily, you know, what it is. So Of One Blood is an adventure thriller, and it has elements of science fiction, yet we're including this in our horror library because there are visions of ghosts, and there's gunplay, and there's prophesizing of the future, and there's murders and deaths. It's not the focus of the book, though. The focus is exploring one's Black identity. That's the focus of it, but it has these speculative and horror elements in it.
That's super cool.
Vathek, the Beetle, is one of the classics of mystery writing by Richard Marsh. Over, I forget, 140 years ago, this was published and is still held today as one of the mystery classics. Yet, it's all about this monster that can turn into a human, that can turn into this monstrous beetle, and there are curses and revenge plots, and it's all interwoven into hypnosis and these deep dives into paranoia. And it says everything about horror, yet it's called a mystery novel. It's a mystery novel, but it's filled with horror. So this is another book, for example, we republish just to showcase, here's what horror can be. You know, here's how it speaks to authors, and this is what we're looking for. So we have,
that's cool,
10 volumes of the Horror Writers Association presents Haunted Library of Horror Classics book. So The King in Yellow, The Mummy, Phantom of the Opera, and a number of others.
And
So
now, do they have a time, like they have to be a certain age, those books?
They don't, but we've generally kept them at works that have been at least 120 years or older. I think some of the books, Vathek is from 1786, I think, and then we have a couple of others. The Castle of Otranto is the original Gothic novel, and that one was back in like 1764. But then we also have Ghost Stories of an Antiquary by M.R. James, and that was 1904. So that was only, 118 years ago.
Are you picking those for trademark reasons mostly, or just because you like them, or both? I mean,
They all have to be in public domain. So they are
that's
definitely public domain books. So we have been taking those and then just adding in kind of additional material, discussion questions so that they can be used in book clubs as well as academia, and also, like my primer series, books that can be promoted to schools, to secondary education, high schools, colleges, creative writing programs, as well as just English programs and literature programs.
so Eric, we will have a link below for that as well.
Okay.
So people can check that out, because I think that's it's fascinating. I love the discussion thing, giving ideas and looking at it. That's
Yeah,
so
and looking
helpful.
at different works as like that were maybe mystery or saying well, it's also horror. It's also
Well, it's kind of the fact that, I mean, now we're sort of entering an era where speculative fiction sort of crosses everything, right? Where it can be, and anything, and we're realizing so much literary fiction, it has speculative elements.
Absolutely.
Because it's imagination, right? I mean,
yeah. And I think when we were young, 120 years ago, all that there was a different, that there's more acceptance that, speculative or fantasy or whatever, these elements with magic realism and everything, that it's literature. It's not like, oh, well, here's your science fiction stuff and here's good literature. It used to be like that. And I think it's not like that anymore, but
it's a lot more blended.
Yeah.
it's more blended. Yeah. And so I think that's really interesting. Though the primer series of undiscovered, right? Well, not undiscovered, but undiscovered by many readers. That's a fabulous thing. Yeah, I can't wait to dive into that series myself.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I hope that you love it.
I think I will. I'm really excited about that. That just sounds so great.
You and all the other readers out there.
Yes.
All the other readers. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And we usually end each episode with the best thing we learned this week, not a personal thing so much as a world thing, which was kind of hard to find for me this week. So, but I did find a few, and one of them was that Canada. So there's good news and bad news. Canada is banning the 7 most used single-use plastics. That's the good news. The bad news, we're not Canadian.
Speak for yourself, that we have Canadian viewers. Yeah, wow. Yeah, it's been hard to find some good news, hasn't it?
It has.
Okay, so I did my usual Google chase down, and this is very tiny, but it's not, because it's actually very heavy. So did you know that a cumulus cloud, those things that look so puffy that we want to ride on as children, can weigh up to 1 million pounds or more?
No. How do you weigh a cloud?
I don't know.
They say that. That's insane.
Well, I guess that's the next question that they don't answer in the little blurbs, but it's because of all the water in them. So, but I mean, are we talking one of those little tiny clouds? You look up and go, oh, look, it's a little pigeon. Or is it one of those big old cloud banks? I don't know.
They didn't tell you.
Didn't answer.
Once again, they didn't tell you how they weighed it or how big the cloud is.
They didn't.
But
They
yeah,
didn't.
I guess
But it
all
was-
the water.
But it was a cool fact. So
That is a cool fact. I'm being crushed by a cloud. That's new horror. Horror, the killer clouds.
It's the fear of like skydiving now. You'll fall through a cloud and unexpectedly to get drowned and crushed to death all at once. A million
that
pounds.
horror element.
Yes, good.
I always find that the horror of horror is saying the freaking word. Because it always sounds like you're saying, who's that healing whore? You know?
Yeah, oh, I'm glad it's not just me, because I have got, everybody's always making fun of the way I say it. So I was like going, oh gosh, do I really have to? And you write the kind of literature.
You're the greatest horror writer ever. Oh my God, no. Immediately banned for the rest of your life from all writing events.
I know.
So Eric, were you able to dig up any
Good.
Good news.
Oh man, I was
Good
totally
news.
Googling it real fast. Like, oh my God, good, positive, uplifting stories because I
Or
keep
weird.
on the news and it's just these shocking and horrible events that go on, and the latest murders and school shootings and political decisions that you don't agree with, and but I don't know. There's nice little uplifting stories. I saw there's a friendship between a cow and a little puppy dog, and that was super cute. I guess.
That is.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I binge on those, and I'll be, especially if I'm in a, low place, it's like, let's go look at animal friend. I'll be having my
Animal friendship.
with animals, we'll be watching animal videos together.
Yeah, I have young kids, so I like to think that's like my joy in life. And I don't need to read the good news because I get to hear about all the good news through my kids, because everything is seen with this like golden aura around it and golden lens. And my daughter is still young enough to run in with the apple and say, "Oh my gosh, Daddy, it's bright red. Look how red this apple is. It's so beautiful." And I'm like, "Oh, all right. That's my joy of the day."
That is joy. Very much.
That's pretty good.
Very nice.
Well, thank you for joining us once again. And we want to thank our wonderful, wonderful producer, Maria Korloff, and our great editor, Sydney Levinson. Thank you so much for joining us on Long Lost Friends.
Yeah, we couldn't do it without the two of them. And if you like the video, if you're enjoying our shows, go down below and leave comments, please, and like it. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any upcoming shows. And if you want to support the publication, MetaStellar, you can visit our Patreon page, and all the money that we get there goes to paying for original new fiction. So it just supports the authors. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Eric, so much for being here with us today. And we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Bye.
Bye.